The medieval queen who bathed in virgin blood to stay young. The countess who couldn't age. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that drifts somewhere between history and whispers in a castle. Dim the lights, settle into your chair, maybe grab a cup of something warm, and let's float across centuries to Hungary, 1580. It's a quiet countryside, birds chirping, smoke rising from chimneys, peasants tending fields. Basically, the perfect backdrop for a fairy tale. Except this one isn't a fairy tale, not really. At the heart of the landscape sits Choctice Castle, looming over the valley like a stone sentinel. Its towers scrape the clouds, its walls thick enough to hide secrets for generations. And inside lives a woman whose name would become synonymous with terror, opulence, and an obsession that sounds like a dream, warped by madness. Countess Elizabeth Báthory, the richest woman in Europe. Rich, beautiful, or at least by some accounts, and utterly convinced that time was her enemy. Of course she was wealthy. Her family's estate stretched like a map across Hungary, and she inherited every bit of it. But Elizabeth wasn't satisfied with money, jewels, or fancy gowns. No, her obsession was simpler, in a disturbingly literal way: youth. She believed that the blood of virgins held the secret to immortality, or at least a 20-year-old skin. And why not? If you had enough gold to buy armies, why not try to cheat death itself? Let's float over to her servants for a moment. Because the Countess didn't do the recruiting herself. That would have been far too mundane. Instead, young girls were promised maid jobs, chances at palace service, a taste of a life they couldn't imagine. 80 girls, maybe more, lured into the castle's shadowed corridors. Their dreams were simple, their fates horrifyingly predictable. Inside Choctice, hidden behind tapestries and locked doors, the Countess had a place no guest ever saw, her private chamber of rituals, what some later called a torture chamber. It smelled faintly of iron and damp stone even when empty. When occupied, the air thickened with fear, with desperation, with the kind of stillness that makes time crawl. Here, girls were hung upside down like cattle. Their throats were slit carefully into silver bathtubs. And Elizabeth, draped in velvet and lace, would immerse herself in the warm, coppery liquid for hours, emerging with skin said to glow like candlelight on a summer evening. She kept meticulous notes. Diaries later discovered in 1720 reveal a horrifying ledger of obsession. 650 victims, each rated according to the freshness of their blood. Sometimes the diary reads like a shopping list, coldly clinical. Other times it drifts into descriptions of skin, scent, the warmth of a bath, and her own reflection. The mirror lies. One entry would read, "I am still beautiful." Of course, the idea that bathing in blood would preserve youth sounds insane. And yet, Elizabeth believed it with the fervor of a woman certain of her own destiny. Noble daughters vanished from neighboring towns, villagers whispered, and still she carried on. Until the moment when King Matthias II could no longer ignore the rumors. A raid was mounted. Soldiers and magistrates stormed the castle, and what they found was gruesome beyond imagination. Drained corpses stacked like firewood, silver bathtubs still sticky with crimson, and halls echoing with centuries of silence. Elizabeth herself refused to speak at trial. She claimed, with cold aristocratic certainty, that noble blood could not be judged. No one could touch her dignity. And so, in what would become her final imprisonment, she was walled into her bedroom, windows bricked shut, sunlight blocked. For 4 years, she survived. She scratched tallies on the walls until her nails bled. Days, weeks, months marked by thin lines. A private calendar of obsession and guilt, or perhaps defiance. Her final diary entries are almost lyrical in their delusion. The mirror lies. I am still beautiful. Even after decades, locked away and starved of companionship, Elizabeth saw herself as she had always wanted to be, immortal, untouched by the decay that claimed the rest of the world. Outside her castle, peasants whispered of the Countess who killed to remain young. Inside, she whispered to herself, imagining the warmth of fresh blood, imagining the laughter of servants who no longer existed, imagining beauty frozen in stone. Even today, the ruins of Choctice Castle bear faint reminders of her presence. On rainy nights, some claim the air smells faintly of rust and iron, the whispers of old horror lingering in the damp stone. The legend persists, not just because of what she did, but because of how she saw herself. Still beautiful, still young, still powerful, even as the world moved on. So, we start not with monsters or curses or screams, but with a woman obsessed with youth. A noblewoman who turned fear into ritual, blood into vanity, and a castle into a private theater of obsession. Let's float over to another corner of her life, where luxury, cruelty, and obsession twist into something almost human, almost understandable. The story of Elizabeth Báthory isn't just the story of blood, castles, and vanity. It's also about control. She had everything a noblewoman could want: estates, wealth, influence over villages, even a reputation that made kings pause. And yet she hungered for something more, something that couldn't be bought or inherited. Youth, she decided, was worth any price. And of course, she had the means to enforce that belief with an almost surgical precision. Her castle, perched high on its rocky outcrop, had corridors that twisted like a maze. Servants often got lost, but not in the way you might imagine. The confusion was deliberate. Hallways, hidden staircases, doors that led nowhere. All of it gave her complete control over who could move, who could hide, and who would vanish. It wasn't just a castle. It was a theater of power, a labyrinth designed for obedience and fear. The girls who came to her were drawn by simple promises: a maid's work, a chance to see the world beyond their tiny villages, a glimpse of something larger. Most were between 12 and 20, innocent enough to trust the nobility without question. They would arrive tired from long walks, perhaps carrying the smallest of belongings, and then, almost immediately, the nature of Elizabeth's obsession became apparent. Her eyes followed them constantly, her servants monitored their every movement, and whispers of strange rituals drifted through the halls at night. And the rituals? Well, they were as meticulous as they were horrifying. Elizabeth believed in process. Timing was essential. Blood, she thought, had to be fresh, taken at precise moments, measured and rated. Some girls were spared for days if she decided their youth or vitality made them more potent. Others were used immediately. She would soak in silver bathtubs, lit by candles for hours at a time. The water would reflect her image, and she would imagine herself reborn with every splash, every ripple. She was methodical in her cruelty, but not without a sort of twisted artistry. Servants recorded her procedures carefully, lists, notes, diagrams even, and these records later became part of the evidence against her. Yet in her mind, this was not murder. It was science. It was beauty. It was survival. And in a way, perhaps she truly believed she was untouchable. After all, she was a countess, a noblewoman whose bloodline traced back to kings. Surely that afforded her some immunity. As her obsession grew, so did the number of victims. The diary entries cataloging these acts read with the cold efficiency of a ledger. She rated the girls, not by personality or kindness, but by the freshness of their blood, the clarity of their youth, and sometimes by how smooth their skin looked after bathing. 650 names, later discovered, each representing a lost life, each a testament to a desire that could not be quenched by wealth or status alone. Outside the castle, life went on as usual, or as usual as it could near such a place. Villagers whispered of strange disappearances, of screaming in the night, of lights that flickered in windows where none should have been. Parents began keeping daughters close, watching the road that led up the hill to the castle. Nobles heard rumors too, but fear, and perhaps complicity, kept them quiet. Who would accuse a woman so powerful that she could ruin families and seize estates with a word? Eventually, though, the warnings grew too loud to ignore. Noble daughters vanished, and the rumors reached King Matthias II. He could no longer turn a blind eye. In 1610, authorities were sent to Chuktice Castle. What they found was beyond even the darkest imaginations. Silver bathtubs stained red, bodies drained and stacked in hidden rooms, walls marred with evidence of cruelty. It wasn't just a crime, it was a theater of obsession, frozen in time. Elizabeth was arrested, yet she remained silent. In the court, she refused to speak, asserting that her noble blood protected her from judgment. This claim, of course, did nothing to mitigate the horror of her acts. She was imprisoned in her own home, windows bricked up, isolated from the world. And yet, in her mind, the mirror still reflected youth, beauty, and the illusion of power. She survived for 4 more years in this self-imposed exile, scratching tallies into stone walls, nails breaking, blood marking the passage of time. There is something almost tragic in this final chapter. The Countess, once omnipotent, reduced to scratching lines on a wall, her obsessions turned inward, mirrored only by the brick and stone of her cell. She clung to the illusion of beauty, the false comfort of vanity, even as her empire crumbled and the world outside moved on. Her story has echoed through centuries not just for the horror of her acts, but for the peculiar human obsession at its core. The attempt to resist time, to cheat mortality, to believe that wealth and power can suspend the most relentless of natural laws. And in that, perhaps, lies the uneasy fascination that keeps her legend alive, from whispered village tales to modern retellings. Even today, the ruins of Choctich Castle seem to hold her presence. Visitors often speak of the faint metallic scent of blood on rainy nights, the way the wind moves through the corridors, whispering of past cruelty, of obsession, of vanity. Elizabeth Báthory remains in our imagination not just as a figure of horror, but as a symbol of the extremes to which human desire can reach when unchecked by morality or empathy. Elizabeth Báthory's life was as much about the performance of power as it was about the pursuit of eternal youth. To understand her, it helps to picture her at the height of her obsession. A castle full of wealth servants moving quietly through shadowed hallways, silver bathtubs filled with warmth and promise, and Elizabeth herself standing in the center, always watching, always calculating. The Countess was not haphazard in her cruelty. Every detail mattered. The angle of the head, the freshness of the blood, the way a girl's skin would glisten in candlelight afterward. Her obsession also extended to appearances beyond her own. Guests would come for banquets, and Elizabeth would sit among them, resplendent in gowns of silk and lace, hands adorned with jewels, her hair perfectly coiled. And yet, behind the calm veneer of noble hospitality, the castle breathed a different rhythm. Footsteps echoed in hidden corridors, and the faint metallic smell of iron lingered in the corners where the unfortunate were brought for rituals. The juxtaposition was almost theatrical, beauty and horror existing side by side, like 2 mirrors reflecting each other endlessly. The girls themselves, of course, were far from instruments. Some resisted, some cried, some tried to flee. Elizabeth's network of loyal servants ensured that escape was nearly impossible. Promises of wages, small freedoms, or even faint reassurances were tools of manipulation. And the castle itself seemed to conspire with her. Hidden passages, staircases that looped back, doors that led nowhere. A young girl could wander for hours hoping for freedom and end up in the very room she had sought to avoid. Her diary reveals fascinating glimpses into her thought process. She didn't write like a monster. She wrote like a meticulous aristocrat cataloging her own empire. Each entry notes not just the act itself, but the conditions, the color of the blood, the temperature of the water, the effect on her skin. It's strange, almost clinical. But occasionally, a line slips through, hinting at vanity or fear, a fleeting worry about age, a note on her appearance, an observation about a particularly young victim. And yet, despite all her control, there were cracks. Rumors began to spread more widely. Servants whispered to villagers. Local mothers kept their daughters close. Even noble families noticed daughters disappearing from neighboring towns, never to return. And while Elizabeth may have believed herself untouchable, history has a way of catching up with even the most insulated aristocrats. Eventually, the web of secrecy began to unravel. King Matthias II, urged by mounting reports and the disappearance of noble girls, ordered an inspection. Soldiers entered Choctich Castle with caution, expecting perhaps corruption, maybe cruelty, but certainly not the sheer scale of obsession they found. Rooms were lined with evidence: silver bathtubs, bodies drained and stacked, chambers marked with the faintest signs of meticulous cruelty. Each discovery was a puzzle, a grim testament to a life spent bending morality to match desire. Elizabeth herself, confronted with the authorities, did not break. She maintained silence, claiming that her noble blood placed her above judgment. It's hard to imagine the certainty required to make such a claim. Noble blood as immunity, arrogant, cold, and perhaps a reflection of a worldview built entirely around her own power. And yet, for all her denial, the sentence was inescapable. She was walled into her private quarters, windows sealed with bricks, her freedom erased, but her obsessions intact. Inside that room, the Countess endured a different sort of prison. No longer a ruler, she had only time. Days became months, months became years. She scratched tallies into the walls, marking the passage of days, perhaps in denial of aging, perhaps as a continuation of her obsessive cataloging of life and death. Nails bleeding from repeated scraping, skin pale from confinement, hair unkempt, Elizabeth remained convinced of her beauty. Mirrors, if she had them, were instruments of reassurance and delusion. She believed with stubborn clarity that she was untouched by decay. Even in isolation, her mind remained active. She imagined the castle as it once was, always bustling with servants, the quiet shuffling of feet on stone floors, the gleam of silver bathtubs, the ritual of blood. Her obsession with youth and beauty never faded. It transformed into a private ritual of memory and imagination. In her diary, the line, "The mirror lies, I am still beautiful," was repeated, almost as a mantra. In this, Elizabeth demonstrates a chilling resilience. Even when the world stripped her of power, she clung to the illusion that had defined her existence. This period of imprisonment, 4 years in total, is perhaps the most telling. Without servants, without guests, without victims, Elizabeth confronted only herself. Her obsession with youth became a meditation, a lonely ritual of self-perception. And it is here, in the quiet echo of a walled room, that her story becomes almost human. Not humane, certainly, but human in the sense that she struggled, adapted, and persisted within the boundaries of her own delusion. The ruins of Chaktich Castle, centuries later, still evoke her presence. Visitors speak of an uncanny atmosphere, the smell of iron in the air after rain, shadows that seem to linger longer than they should, a sense of unease threaded through the stone corridors. These remnants are not just of blood or cruelty, but of obsession, of a mind that bent itself around the desire to resist time. Elizabeth Báthory remains a symbol, a cautionary tale, and a figure of fascination precisely because her obsession with youth turned into a lifestyle of horror, yet reflected a very human struggle against the inevitability of decay. And so, even as centuries pass, the story drifts on. Elizabeth Báthory, the noblewoman who bathed in virgin blood to preserve youth, continues to capture imagination. Not solely for her cruelty, but for the strange intersection of power, vanity, and human obsession. Her life, her diaries, her castle, they are windows into a world where wealth could almost buy immortality, and where the desire to remain beautiful eclipsed morality, compassion, and reason. Even now, the whisper of her story floats through history, a faint metallic scent in the rain, the echo of footsteps in empty corridors, the reflection of youth imagined in cracked mirrors. A reminder that obsession, unchecked by empathy, can leave marks that endure long after life itself has ended. Isolation, delusion, and the endless mirror. Elizabeth Báthory's imprisonment transformed her world. The castle, once alive with servants, rituals, and whispered footsteps, became a quiet tomb of stone and shadow. Bricked-up windows cut off sunlight, leaving only the faintest flicker of light from cracks in the walls, long enough to glance at a mirror or imagine herself in her former glory. Time stretched and folded. Days merged into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. Outside, life went on. Peasants tilled fields, nobles discussed politics, and yet inside, Elizabeth's mind spun in a private orbit, obsessed with youth and reflection. The lines she scratched into the walls became her calendar, her diary, her only company. Nail marks traced the passage of time, jagged and bleeding, a record of days endured and obsessions maintained. 4 years she endured this way, a cruel experiment of patience and vanity. It is hard to imagine the resolve it required. She could not leave, could not touch another soul. could not indulge in the rituals that had defined her life, and yet she refused to surrender her belief in her own beauty. The mirror, if she could see it, was both her friend and her adversary, reflecting her features, confirming youth in some moments, lying in others. Inside this prison, Elizabeth's mind replayed her life as a continuous performance. She remembered the corridors, the whispers of servants, the glint of silver in candlelight, and the warmth of blood in her baths. Each memory was ritualized, catalogued, and analyzed as though the past could somehow maintain her youth. Her obsession had become entirely mental, a theater of imagination sustained by isolation. She rehearsed each bath in her head, counted each victim, measured each reflection, and found solace in the illusion of eternal beauty. The mantra in her diary, "The mirror lies, I am still beautiful," became almost sacred, a repetition she whispered to herself in the dark. Even her imagination couldn't escape the obsessive logic she had cultivated over decades. Elizabeth recalled meticulously selecting girls for their freshness, noting the warmth, the tone of their skin, the clarity of their blood. Each choice had once been deliberate, calculated, almost clinical. Now, in isolation, she replayed those choices endlessly, like a scholar reviewing notes, analyzing efficacy, and imagining the results. It is remarkable how deeply ritual had embedded itself into her psyche, transforming acts of horror into procedures, obsessions into mental exercises, vanity into survival. Yet, the delusions of power and beauty were fragile. Though she convinced herself of youth, the body, her own, contained within cold stone walls, aged regardless. Skin grew pale, hands brittle, nails cracked from years of scratching tallies. She could not bathe in blood, could not summon the servants to perform rituals. Her wealth, her influence, her prestige, all rendered meaningless by masonry. And still, she clung to the reflection, to the illusion of control. This paradox defined her final years. Power without action, ritual without effect, beauty without validation. Outside, the world began to codify her story into legend. Peasants whispered of the Blood Countess, tales stretching from village to village, morphed by fear and imagination. Her deeds were recounted in hushed tones, stories of vanished girls, silver tubs, and a castle soaked in crimson. Nobles debated her culpability and the limits of justice for women of power, while chroniclers later wrote accounts tinged with disbelief. Even death, for her, became a narrative of speculation, a symbol of aristocratic hubris. History began its work, separating the myth from reality, yet unable to erase the lingering dread her name inspired. Elizabeth's diaries, discovered over a century later, reveal her internal world with chilling clarity. She noted the passage of days, her thoughts about her fading reflection, and occasional references to beauty, as if it were a measurable, tangible quality. The meticulous cataloging of victims, the obsession with ritual, and the fixation on youth all persisted, even when the opportunity to act had vanished. Her life, in essence, became a private theater, rehearsing the same obsession endlessly against stone walls and shadowed corridors. It is easy to view Elizabeth as merely cruel, monstrous, or insane, but there is another lens, that of a human being confronting mortality, obsessed with resisting time, and elevated, or perhaps corrupted, by privilege and isolation. Her story reflects an intersection of wealth, vanity, obsession, and power, magnified by a society that allowed her to act unchecked for decades. The cruelty is undeniable, but so too is the human element, the fear of aging, the desire to preserve beauty, the compulsion to control, catalog, and perfect. In her final years, Elizabeth existed almost entirely within her own mind. The castle that had once been her stage became her prison. Mirrors, walls, and the scratching of tallies defined her universe. Each day she negotiated with reflection and memory, reconstructing rituals in her imagination, convincing herself that the beauty she once sought still existed, still clung to her, still validated her existence. And in that slow, quiet unraveling, she became both prisoner and observer. Her obsession crystallized into a life of introspection, ritual, and isolation. Countess Castle, centuries later, retains this aura. Visitors speak of lingering unease, of cold drafts moving unnaturally, of the faint iron scent on rainy nights, as though the past refuses to dissolve. The legend of Elizabeth Báthory endures because it reflects more than horror. It reflects obsession, vanity, and the lengths to which a mind can stretch when fueled by wealth, power, and unrelenting fear of mortality. Her life continues to fascinate not simply because of blood or cruelty, but because it exemplifies the human struggle against the inevitable, framed within the extremes of privilege and obsession, vanity, memory, and the weight of isolation. In the quiet darkness of her bricked-up room, Elizabeth Báthory existed in a strange kind of suspended reality. 4 years of solitude had transformed her daily existence into ritualized repetition. The grand halls of Countess Castle, once echoing with footsteps and whispers, now survived only in her memory. Every corner of the castle, every corridor, every glint of silver and flicker of candlelight was rehearsed endlessly in her mind. She imagined herself moving through the familiar spaces, performing the acts that had once defined her life, bathing, cataloging, and admiring her own reflection as though the act itself could exist without the physical world. The scratching of tallies on her walls became a form of meditation, a chronicle of passing days, months, and years. Her nails, cracked and bloody, recorded time like a morbid metronome. In each line she inscribed the obsessive rhythm of her existence, blending measurement, memory, and madness. To Elizabeth, these marks were evidence of survival, of resistance against decay and mortality. They were also a map of her mind, chaotic, meticulous, obsessive, and solitary. Each tally was a testament to a woman who refused to accept the limits of human life, even when the physical world had stripped her of action, luxury, and freedom. She spent hours imagining the rituals she could no longer perform. She imagined young girls, unaware of the horrors awaiting them, and she catalogued them in her memory as she had once done in her diaries. The details were vivid: the warmth of skin, the clarity of blood, the way light shimmered across silver bathtubs. These acts, once horrifyingly real, were now entirely mental exercises. They allowed her to maintain the illusion of control, of purpose, and of beauty. The obsession with youth and vanity, which had guided her life, became the architecture of her survival. Elizabeth's reflection, real or imagined, remained central to her existence. Mirrors, where available, were scrutinized endlessly. Her features, once pampered with oils, lotions, and rituals, now existed only in the dim, flickering light or in her mind's eye. She convinced herself that the mirror lied when it failed to show her beauty, repeating, almost as a chant, "I am still beautiful." It was a mantra of denial, a thread of delusion carefully maintained against the relentless passage of time. The line between truth and imagination blurred, and Elizabeth became both observer and participant in the theater of her own vanity. Occasionally, she reflected on the girls whose lives she had taken, though not in a way that revealed remorse. Instead, they became part of the narrative she repeated internally, measured and catalogued as if life itself could be preserved in memory. This obsession with record-keeping, repetition, and reflection mirrored the meticulousness she had applied in her diaries during freedom. Only now, there were no pages, no ink, no witnesses, just stone walls and tallied scratches, the rhythm of obsession echoing in an empty room. Beyond her private world, the story of Elizabeth Báthory had already begun its journey into legend. Peasants spoke in whispers of the Blood Countess, recounting tales of vanished girls, silver bathtubs, and the shadow of a woman whose beauty was said to persist through death and cruelty. Nobles debated her crimes in secret, discussing the limits of aristocratic immunity, the accountability of women in positions of power, and the role of rumor and justice. Chroniclers later attempted to catalogue her life with historical precision, but even they were touched by the mythos, blending fact and fear into a narrative that has endured for centuries. The legend persists, not only for horror, but for its reflection of human obsession. Elizabeth's story is as much about vanity, power, and the fear of aging as it is about cruelty. It demonstrates how privilege can amplify obsession, how isolation can twist the mind, and how the human desire to resist mortality can lead to acts that defy morality, empathy, and reason. Even in confinement, Elizabeth clung to her reflection, rehearsed her rituals mentally, and measured time in scratches and mantras. She was, in essence, a prisoner of both stone and vanity, her mind the last domain in which she exercised power. The ruins of Chaktiche Castle still carry her imprint. Visitors report an uncanny atmosphere, cold drafts, faint metallic scents, and shadows that linger longer than expected. The legend of the Countess, whether entirely accurate or embroidered through centuries of retelling, remains a cautionary tale about obsession and human desire. Elizabeth Báthory's life illustrates the extremes to which wealth, power, and vanity can drive a person, transforming ordinary fear of aging into a narrative of cruelty, ritual, and relentless self-perception. And in the quiet echo of the castle's stone corridors, her story continues to float through history. The girl who believed blood could preserve youth, the noblewoman who catalogued life and death with obsessive precision, the prisoner who scratched mantras into stone to maintain a delusion of beauty. Elizabeth Báthory exists both in fact and in legend. Her life reminds us that obsession, unchecked by morality or empathy, can leave marks not only on those directly harmed, but on history itself, lingering in shadowed halls, whispered tales, and the imagination of all who hear her story. Legacy of blood and stone. Even after Elizabeth Báthory's death, the shadow of her life stretched long over Chaktiche Castle and across Hungary. The stories that survived were already tinged with myth, as if centuries had been eager to add their own brushstrokes to a painting of cruelty and obsession. Peasants told tales of blood-soaked hallways, silver bathtubs glinting in candlelight, and the echo of footsteps long gone. Nobles debated in hushed tones how someone so powerful, so wealthy, could commit acts so unspeakable and yet cling to their own sense of invulnerability. And chroniclers, working decades later, tried to separate truth from rumor, though the lines blurred as easily as water in a silver tub. Elizabeth's obsession with youth became the focal point of legend. She had not merely killed, she had performed a ritual of vanity, combining superstition, science, and a meticulous attention to detail. It is said she believed her blood baths would preserve her skin, keep her cheeks unlined, and allow her to live free from the marks of time. And for a while, perhaps, it seemed to work. Her skin was noted in contemporary accounts as unusually pale, smooth, and seemingly impervious to age. The illusion, however, was fragile. Power can only extend so far, and time, even for a countess, moves inexorably forward. Yet obsession has a persistence that death cannot entirely erase. Elizabeth's diaries, discovered over a century later, preserved her logic, her rituals, and the obsession with perfection that had defined her life. Each entry, coldly meticulous, catalogued victims, detailed the steps of her baths, and assessed the quality of blood as though it were a rare ingredient in a complex recipe. Some passages are clinical, stripped of emotion. Others drift into vanity and self-reflection, noting her appearance and the glimmer of youth in her skin. They read as the work of a woman simultaneously obsessed with life, terrified of decay, and completely unmoored from the world beyond her walls. And then there is the castle itself. Chaktiche, perched like a sentinel over the valley, remains a monument to history, obsession, and the extremes of human behavior. Visitors who wander its ruins speak of echoes and shadows, of corridors that twist unnaturally, and of a lingering metallic scent that seems to bloom with rainfall. Some claim that on quiet nights, the stones themselves whisper, recounting the steps of a woman who refused to surrender to age, mortality, or conscience. The architecture becomes inseparable from legend, with every spiral staircase, hidden passage, and vaulted ceiling folded into the mythos of the Blood Countess. Elizabeth's story also touches on the paradox of human morality and power. She was a noblewoman, a landowner, and a figure of immense influence. Her social status insulated her from immediate consequence for decades, allowing obsession to flourish unchecked. The girls who vanished, mostly peasants, were powerless in comparison. And yet, when royal authority finally intervened, the system exacted a punishment that was both fitting and cruel. Confinement, isolation, and the slow, private unraveling of a mind that had spent decades exercising control over life and death. There is a peculiar symmetry in this punishment. Elizabeth, who once dictated life and death with precision, was forced into a situation where she could control nothing. Her rituals became imaginary, her authority null, and the very thing she feared, aging, decay, mortality, crept forward relentlessly, even if her mind refused to acknowledge it. The act of scratching tallies on stone walls, bloody and repetitive, was at once a defiance and a concession. She could not stop time, but she could measure it, mark it, and pretend she had mastery over it. Over time, Elizabeth became less a figure of immediate terror and more a symbol of obsession, vanity, and human desire run to extremes. Her name, once whispered in fear, became a fixture in folklore, literature, and popular imagination. Writers and chroniclers marveled at her meticulous diaries, her methodical cruelty, and the audacity of her belief in the transformative power of blood. In this way, her legacy straddled fact and fiction. The historical Countess and the legendary Blood Countess merged, leaving a figure larger than life, whose story continues to fascinate centuries later. Even today, there is a quiet, lingering fascination with Elizabeth Báthory. She is both cautionary and compelling, a woman who reached beyond the limits of human morality to resist the inevitable, whose vanity and obsession created a private theater of horror, yet whose story illuminates very human fears. The Countess reminds us that history is rarely black and white. It is a blend of wealth, privilege, obsession, and consequence, all intertwined in a narrative that stretches far beyond her own lifetime. As rain falls over the ruins of Countess Castle, it seems to wash across centuries, carrying with it the weight of memory and myth. The story of Elizabeth Báthory remains alive not just in books or legends, but in the imagination, a quiet echo of obsession, vanity, and the strange, sometimes terrifying lengths to which humans will go to preserve what they cannot hold. The making of a monster, or just a woman of her time. Let's drift for a moment, away from the dripping stone corridors of Countess Castle and float backward, before the blood, before the diaries, before the silver bathtubs. Because Elizabeth Báthory didn't begin as a legend. She began, rather inconveniently, as a baby. Born in 1560 into one of the most powerful Protestant noble families in Hungary, she entered a world built entirely on bloodlines. And no, not the dripping kind, at least not yet. The Báthorys were practically royalty. They owned land, money, and titles that stretched across Transylvania and beyond. One relative had been King of Poland, another had served as the Prince of Transylvania. Power wasn't just inherited in this family. It was practically fermented, passed down through generations like a particularly strong vintage wine. So of course Elizabeth was raised to believe she was special, important, unquestionable, that her will was, by definition, the right one. It's not exactly a recipe for humility, but power has a way of isolating people, and Elizabeth's early years already carried the seeds of her later obsession. Her education was exceptional for a woman of her time. She could read and write in several languages, studied mathematics, and was known for her intelligence. But she was also surrounded by stories of disease, superstition, and punishment. Public executions were, for the nobility, a kind of grim entertainment. Torture, even among the powerful, was accepted as justice. It is not an excuse, but it helps explain how someone could grow up believing that suffering and control were simply part of maintaining order. Then there was her marriage. Elizabeth was 15 when she was engaged to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a powerful soldier who came from another elite family. The wedding itself was so extravagant that it took 3 days for all the festivities to conclude. Their union consolidated massive wealth and influence, making Elizabeth one of the richest women in Europe. But behind the silks and ceremonies, the match was a cold one. Ferenc was often away at war, and when he was home, he reportedly amused himself by inventing new ways to punish disobedient servants. One wonders what their dinner conversations were like. With her husband gone for long stretches, Elizabeth managed vast estates and hundreds of servants on her own. She was sharp, calculating, and perfectly capable of maintaining order. But loneliness and unchecked authority make a dangerous combination. She had no one to challenge her, no one to say, "Maybe don't do that." In a world where power meant domination, Elizabeth began to blend discipline, vanity, and superstition into a private philosophy. And then, of course, came tragedy. Ference died in 1604 after a long illness, leaving Elizabeth a widow at 44. The grief was real, but so was the vacuum of power. Her husband's death marked a turning point, the moment when her behavior, already eccentric, began to spiral. With no one to rein her in, Elizabeth retreated into obsession. Her focus shifted from running estates to preserving beauty. She surrounded herself with alchemists, herbalists, and astrologers, all promising secret remedies against age. Potions, tinctures, creams, all the fashionable absurdities of early modern wellness culture. And when none of it worked, she simply escalated. Some historians suggest her crimes began as punishments, severe but not unusual for the era. A servant girl brushed her hair too roughly, perhaps, and Elizabeth struck her. When blood appeared, rumor has it that she noticed how the girl's skin, under the wound, looked fresh. Whether that moment actually happened is impossible to prove, but like all good legends, it fits too perfectly. It's the spark of madness that storytellers love to preserve. And once the idea took root, that youth could be reclaimed through blood, Elizabeth's vanity found its ultimate outlet. Servants began disappearing. Peasant girls were invited to the castle with promises of work. The rituals became routine. She wasn't just punishing disobedience now, she was transforming cruelty into medicine. In her mind, she wasn't committing murder, she was maintaining perfection. There's an irony here that almost feels deliberate. For all her supposed brilliance, Elizabeth was trapped by the same societal pressures that confined other women of her age. Only hers were gilded and exaggerated. Her worth, like every noblewoman's, was tied to her beauty. Her status depended on appearances. And unlike peasants who aged without choice or ceremony, Elizabeth had the means to fight it. The difference is simply that she had too much power, too few limits, and far too much imagination. By the time the whispers reached the royal court, she had already crossed every conceivable line. Her castle had become a mausoleum disguised as luxury, a place where wealth and death coexisted, both gleaming in candlelight. And when the walls finally closed around her, she carried her obsession with her, as though imprisonment were merely another phase of ritual. Centuries later, we're still talking about her, still fascinated, horrified, and quietly intrigued. Because beyond the horror lies a story about vanity, fear, and the human refusal to accept time's quiet cruelty. Elizabeth Báthory wasn't just the Blood Countess. She was a product of her age, educated, powerful, isolated, and obsessed with the one thing her wealth couldn't buy: youth. Her story endures not because of the violence, but because of what it reflects back at us. That same desire to resist aging, to control appearance, to cheat nature. It hasn't gone away. The rituals have changed, the ingredients are different, but the motivation remains eerily familiar. And that is, perhaps, the real reason Elizabeth Báthory still haunts history. She was just a little too human in her obsession. The Trial of Shadows. When silence spoke, louder than words. Let's step into that cold winter of 1611. Snow was falling over the kingdom of Hungary, the kind that muffles sound and makes even horror feel distant. But in Pressburg, today's Bratislava, the silence was broken by the echo of iron boots and parchment scrolls. The trial of Countess Elizabeth Báthory had begun. She wasn't there, of course. The most powerful woman in the region, sealed behind walls in her own castle, was declared too noble to stand before a common court. Her servants, however, were not so fortunate. One by one, they were dragged into the great hall, faces pale, hands bound, each forced to recount what they had seen inside Choctich Castle. The atmosphere was heavy, the air thick with tension, curiosity, and a quiet sense of theater. Nobles leaned forward on carved benches. Scribes dipped their quills. Priests whispered prayers, though one wonders who they were for, the accused or themselves. Testimony poured like oil onto fire. The servants described the chambers, the instruments, the punishments. Some cried as they spoke. Others stared blankly, numb after years of fear. They spoke of a woman who moved through the halls in silence, her footsteps soft, but her commands absolute. Of girls lured by promises of work, only to vanish behind locked doors. of how the walls, even after scrubbing, carried stains that never faded. It's difficult even now to separate truth from spectacle. Some testimonies were likely exaggerated. Torture was a common method of interrogation, and confessions made under pain are slippery things. Yet the consistency of detail across so many voices, 46 witnesses in total, painted a chilling pattern. Whether she killed a handful or hundreds, it was clear Elizabeth's cruelty had reached beyond rumor. And then came the objects, presented before the court like relics of a twisted faith: needles, branding irons, chains, fragments of cloth, even a blood-stained tablecloth taken from the castle kitchen. Each item a silent accusation, each one telling its own version of the same story. Still, Elizabeth never spoke. No confession, no denial. She refused to appear, refused to write, refused to beg. The silence, in a way, became her final act of control. For a woman who had once commanded everything around her, it was as if she'd decided that the last thing she'd ever own would be her voice, and she would keep it to herself. Her accomplices, however, were not so privileged. 2 of her maids were executed by burning, their screams echoing over the frozen river. Another was decapitated. A 4th, spared death for her youth, was sentenced to life imprisonment. The message was clear. The noblewoman's blood would not be spilled, but someone's had to be. As the trials concluded, King Matthias II faced a dilemma. He owed Elizabeth money, a substantial debt her late husband had lent the crown. Executing her would mean forfeiting that debt. Imprisoning her, on the other hand, preserved the royal ledger. And so a compromise was struck. She would live, but within walls, sealed away from the world she once ruled. Choctich Castle became her tomb. In August 1614, 3 years after her trial, she wrote her final note to the guards, complaining that her hands were cold. The next morning, they found her body still and pale, as if she had finally turned into the marble figure she always wished to be. But death didn't end her story. It only set it free. The myths grew immediately. Some said her servants heard her laughing in the dark even after her burial. Others claimed the earth around her grave turned black and refused to grow grass. Local villagers avoided the site entirely, muttering prayers whenever the castle's silhouette appeared against the moonlight. Centuries passed, and her name began to change shape. From noblewoman to legend, from legend to monster. In 1729, a Jesuit priest named Laszlo Turoczy published a chronicle calling her the Blood Countess. It was the first time the phrase appeared in print, and it spread like wildfire. Plays, operas, and stories followed, each retelling pushing the tale further into darkness. By the 18th century, she wasn't merely a murderer. She had become a vampire of history. And in that transformation lies something curious. The line between history and horror blurred so completely that no one could tell which parts were real anymore. The diaries, if they ever existed, vanished. The bodies were never formally counted. Some historians now suggest that Elizabeth was framed, a victim of political greed, that her lands were too rich, her influence too strong, and her gender too inconvenient. That the trial was merely a way to erase a powerful woman from the map of Hungarian politics. Perhaps there's truth in that. Power, after all, has always feared the woman who doesn't yield. Elizabeth ruled without a husband, commanded soldiers, and owned estates larger than some kingdoms. To the men around her, she was both asset and threat. Maybe the truth lies somewhere between the myth and the accusation. A woman whose cruelty was real, but whose legend was stretched by those who found it convenient. A mirror of the age's obsession with beauty and punishment, power and fear. When we look at Elizabeth Báthory now, across 4 centuries of storytelling, she no longer stands as a single person. She is a reflection, a composite of every fear and fascination we've ever projected onto women with power. The monster who bathed in blood, the countess who defied her time, the victim of politics, the saint of vanity. And as her castle crumbles quietly on a Slovak hill, surrounded by grass and mist, one truth remains steady. History has never truly buried her. It only changed the shape of her coffin. Echoes of the Countess. When history refuses to forget. Let's drift forward a few centuries. The castle is quiet now, Countess stands as little more than stone bones, walls torn open by time, stairways that go nowhere, and a few crumbling turrets where bats roost in peace. The villagers pass it on the road without looking up, as if the structure itself might stare back. They whisper that the wind that blows through its ruins smells faintly of iron. It's a strange thing, how history works. Some names vanish entirely, erased by time. Others grow larger, heavier, and darker the longer they're told. Elizabeth Báthory became the latter. She stopped being a person somewhere along the way. She turned into a story people tell to warn their daughters not to be vain, and to remind their sons that beauty, like power, is a dangerous kind of hunger. By the 19th century, the Countess had entered literature. Writers like Bram Stoker read about her trial while researching for Dracula. You can almost see how she slipped into his imagination. The idea of nobility feeding on innocence, of castles filled with beauty and decay. Elizabeth's legend fit perfectly into that new Gothic hunger for the romantic and the terrifying. But even beyond fiction, she lingered in the cultural bloodstream. Historians debated her guilt. Some swore she killed hundreds. Others claimed her enemies fabricated everything. The most cynical pointed to the math: hundreds of acres of rich land, all conveniently absorbed by the crown after her arrest. A dead woman can't dispute property transfers. And yet, despite all that, her myth refuses to fade. Because it scratches an itch that humanity never quite gets rid of. The fascination with what lies behind locked doors, especially when those doors belong to the rich and beautiful. Imagine walking through those corridors now, centuries later. The stones would feel cold, but not haunted, just old. The kind of old that absorbs stories rather than tells them. Somewhere under the debris might lie the foundation of her chamber, the one where she was sealed alive. Some locals say that if you press your ear to the stone, you can hear scratching. Others say that's just mice. Legends tend to stretch like shadows at sunset. The further away we get from the person, the taller and stranger they become. Elizabeth's story has done exactly that. In some retellings, she's practically supernatural. In others, she's the scapegoat of an empire built on patriarchy and greed. Either way, she's become a mirror, reflecting whatever fear or fascination people bring to her. It is also worth remembering, Elizabeth lived in a time when women of power had to walk on knives. If she were too kind, she'd be dismissed. Too cruel, she'd be feared. Too beautiful, she'd be envied. Too old, she'd be forgotten. Maybe that's what makes her story still resonate. She's not just a villain. She's the embodiment of a question that hasn't aged a day. What happens to a woman who refuses to fade quietly? In life, she was both adored and despised. In death, she became eternal. That's not immortality in the mystical sense. It's worse. It's the immortality of gossip. Her legend seeped into art, film, music. Even modern horror movies borrow her image. A pale woman, calm and regal, surrounded by candlelight and blood. The Countess archetype. Cold, composed, untouchable. People still dress as her every Halloween, not realizing that, under the lace and velvet, the real woman died alone in a dark room, counting the days until she forgot her own name. And maybe that's the saddest part of all. For someone who spent her life chasing beauty, she became the ugliest story in European history. For someone who craved eternal youth, she became eternally old, trapped in the past, preserved only in fear. But history has a sense of irony. 400 years later, people still visit Countess Castle. They climb the hill with cameras and water bottles, standing where her tower once loomed. Some leave flowers, some take stones, some come just to feel a chill, a whisper of something ancient. But what they always find is silence. The kind of silence that feels like a held breath. And if you stand there long enough, as the sun sinks and the fog begins to rise, the landscape looks almost gentle. The castle's edges blur, the fields shimmer, and you realize nothing remains of her cruelty except stories. Stones don't keep blood. Grass grows over everything eventually. Maybe that's what she never understood. Youth fades, beauty fades, fear fades, but stories, they outlast everyone. And in that quiet immortality, Elizabeth Báthory finally got what she wanted. Not eternal youth, just eternal attention. So tonight, if you ever find yourself walking past a crumbling fortress in the middle of nowhere, and you feel the air turn cold for no reason, Don't panic. That's not her ghost. It's just her memory brushing past. A gentle reminder that even monsters were once human, and even humans can become myths when no one's watching. Let's float away from the castle now. The torches have burned out, the halls are empty, and the Countess of Blood sleeps under stone and legend. And maybe, somewhere deep in that endless dark, she's still whispering to herself. The mirror lies. I am still beautiful. The woman, the myth, and the silence. After hey, you're still here. That's kind of fitting, isn't it? We've spent a long time wandering through dark corridors, listening to whispers that might never have existed. And now that the story's nearly over, everything feels still. The torches are out, the castle's just a pile of stones. And Elizabeth Báthory, the woman who couldn't stand to grow old, has been asleep for more than 400 years. So let's sit here for a while, right where her legend ends. Imagine the castle at night. No wind, just the soft sound of your own breath. The locals say that on foggy evenings, if you look up from the village, you can see one window in the ruined tower glowing faintly. Of course, there's no window left, just open air and ivy. But stories don't care about facts. They only care about how they feel. And the story of the Blood Countess feels cold, decadent, and strangely sad. Because beneath all the blood and legend, Elizabeth was a human being. A rich one, a powerful one, a very likely cruel one, but still human. She laughed, she ate, she slept, she aged. Maybe she cried the first time she noticed her face changing in the mirror. Maybe she didn't. But the truth is, vanity doesn't start with monsters. It starts with mirrors. And in her world, beauty was currency. For noblewomen, it was power disguised as charm. The younger you looked, the safer you were. The older you got, the closer you were to being replaced or forgotten. That kind of pressure can make anyone desperate. It just so happened that Elizabeth had the wealth, the servants, and the isolation to take that desperation to its darkest extreme. History, of course, didn't forgive her. It rarely forgives women who fall from grace, especially not those who wielded real authority. In her lifetime, she was the richest noblewoman in Central Europe. She managed vast estates, negotiated politics, and even raised armies when needed. And maybe that alone made her dangerous. Because power, when worn by a woman, always looks suspicious in the eyes of men. So what's left now? A ruined castle, a few old letters, a handful of trial transcripts written by men who already decided she was guilty before the ink even dried, and centuries of retellings that turned her from a person into a monster, because monsters sell better than politics. Still, there's something strangely poetic about her afterlife. She wanted eternal beauty, and she got eternal attention instead. Every generation revives her story in some new form. Films, books, songs, even perfumes named after her. She became a brand of darkness, a luxury myth. Maybe that's the closest thing to immortality any of us ever get. Let's float, just for a moment, back to that final night in her cell. The guards found her lying still on the floor, wrapped in furs, her hand resting on her chest. The air was cold, the candle had burned out, and the room smelled of damp stone. She looked peaceful, they said. Almost ordinary. Not a villain, not a countess. Just a woman who had finally stopped chasing youth. They buried her somewhere nearby, but the exact spot was never marked. Too many villagers protested. They didn't want her resting on holy ground, so her body disappeared into the soil, unrecorded, unblessed. Maybe that was her punishment, or maybe it was freedom. One last secret she got to keep from the world. And now every time someone writes her name, tells her story, or makes a video about her, it's like lighting a small candle in that endless dark room. She's remembered again. She's still alive in whispers and retellings. The woman who tried to defy time ended up owning it instead. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the echo of her heels on marble, the rustle of her gown as she passes through a candlelit hall, the faintest hum of a woman speaking to her reflection. Not out of vanity anymore, but maybe curiosity, wondering what she became. The truth is, history doesn't sleep. It just changes shape, shifts its tone, and waits for someone to look again. And that's what we've done tonight. Looked again. Not to excuse her, not to glorify her, but to understand the strange, uncomfortable ways that beauty, power, and fear have always danced together through time. So, if you're lying there in the dark, listening to this story fade, take a deep breath. Let it go. Elizabeth Báthory is long gone. Her castle is dust. Her mirrors shattered. But the lesson she left behind still lingers like perfume in an empty room. That the pursuit of perfection, taken far enough, always ends in ruin. Now the night's almost over. The castle is quiet again. And you can finally drift to sleep knowing that some monsters don't need to haunt us anymore. They've already told their story. Good night, Countess, and good night to you too. Tonight we drift into the darkest corridors of history, where beauty became obsession and vanity turned into legend. This is the haunting story of Countess Elizabeth Báthory. The woman who bathed in virgin blood to stay young, who defied time itself and paid the price in madness and silence. Her castle still stands in ruins, her name whispered like a curse. But behind every myth, there's a woman who refused to fade quietly. So dim the lights, close your eyes, and let's step into the cold halls of her forgotten world. Because tonight, Stories Before Sleep is opening the door to the